Hello friends, this is Vision Overseas. We are providing both online and offline coaching with most repeated and authentic practice material. Once you join our coaching, you will be updated with latest practice material for next quarter. If you have any question or query, you can visit our website thevisionoverseas.com, and even you can contact us on given WhatsApp number for more details. Thank you.
But how does the hormone induce overindulgence? To find out, researchers at McGill University trained volunteers to associate random images with the smell of food. For example, every time they saw a tree, they might get a whiff of freshly baked bread. At the same time, some of the subjects received ghrelin. Others got only saline. Ghrelin is produced in the stomach, and its levels rise before your habitual mealtimes and after you haven't eaten for an extended period. So the hormone reminds you to put something in your belly. Injecting rats with ghrelin encourages them to eat, and people who receive a dose of ghrelin grab extra helpings from the buffet.
You've probably seen those little cards in hotel rooms. Towel on the floor if you want a fresh one. Towel on the rack if you'll use it again. And using towels more than once means less laundry, which saves water and energy. But you don't pay the utility bills at the hotel, so do you really care? In other words,
bingo. Dino DNA.
Of course, ichthyosaurs were not dinosaurs, but the Jurassic Park methodology is what's important. So could we resurrect one starting from their protein sequences?
Yeah, well, perhaps. You should never say never. So from having blubber, we can say that to some extent the ichthyosaurs, they must have been warm-blooded, so to say, at least to the same degree as the modern leatherback turtle.
The write-up and photos of the fossil are in the journal Nature. And there's one more intriguing secret contained in the remains, proteinaceous material, which makes you wonder, if you sequenced it, could you go backwards and reconstruct the DNA that coded for the proteins?
Which is kind of amazing.
Johan Lindegren, a paleontologist at Lund University in Sweden.
It turns out that the skin is still there, with cells and cellular organelles, and even traces of the original biomolecular makeup.
Those remains revealed that the ichthyosaur sported camouflage, appropriate for its underwater environment. Light on the bottom, darker on top, just like many marine animals have today. Long before dolphins swam the seas, their near look-alike ichthyosaurs inhabited the Earth's oceans. Now scientists say those ancient seafaring reptiles may have had more in common with modern-day sea turtles and marine mammals than we knew. Over time, a dead animal's bones can be slowly replaced by minerals, leaving behind a rocky fossil. The researchers demineralized the 180-million-year-old fossil of an ichthyosaur, and it left behind soft, flexible tissue. Decoding the sounds could be important not just for boosting panda numbers, Owen says, but for avoiding very bad dates.
These are bears, and they have sharp teeth and claws, and they can do a lot of damage to one another if they don't want to be around each other.
And these fine-tuned communication skills also make the case that the social lives of pandas are anything but black and white. Owen and her colleagues analyzed more than 2,500 panda sounds recorded during breeding introductions, and they analyzed the audio's acoustic qualities. Their study in the journal Royal Society Open Science is a sort of how-to guide for panda breeders, cataloging the various vocal characteristics of a blind date. You've got an uninterested roar, or a bark, a more ambiguous chirp, or an amorous bleat. If you're a giant panda, this sound means romance.
I wouldn't call it a romantic serenade.
Megan Owen is a conservation biologist at the San Diego Zoo's Institute for Conservation Research.
There's nothing soft or demure about it.
And yet that sound, called a bleat,
That's B-L-E-A-T, just like a goat.
signals that a panda couple has hit it off, and copulation is nigh. Your genome is sort of like a library, with each gene an instruction manual for making proteins. The bad news is you can't return a book and take out a new edition. But the technique of gene therapy allows you to revise your copy of the book, so to speak, giving you the ability, potentially, to make new and different proteins.
If the bromeliad's water tank was too large, then the frog's head can't form a tight seal around the opening, which would make them and their offspring an easy meal. But if the pool was too small, it might dry out completely.
So they are really picky concerning their houses. They need a clean house with fresh water, and it should not be too large, not too small.
In all, Soleil and his team surveyed 239 bromeliads within a protected part of Brazil's Atlantic rainforest, of which 74 were occupied by frogs. The frogs preferred big bromeliads, but the very largest bromeliads were unoccupied by the frogs, which suggests there's a Goldilocks situation. And the researchers think it has to do with the size of the frogs' alligator-shaped heads.
So crazy that there are some really nice big bromeliads, and I never found our frog there. If I would be the frog, I would like that bromeliad.
Herpetologist Mirko Soleil from Brazil's State University of Santa Cruz, quoting his graduate student Amanda Lanter Silva.
But then we made that research and we saw that there were trade-offs.
These tiny pools are technically known as phytotelmata, from the Greek words for plant and pond. A male finds a bromeliad and attracts a female, who lays her eggs directly into the water. The male stays behind to guard the eggs and the tadpoles, spending the rest of his life within that one plant. But not just any bromeliad pool will do. In the jungle, home is anywhere you can raise your babies, while trying not to get gobbled up by somebody else. Take a tiny creature from Brazil, whose name is longer than it is. The Bahia's broad snout cascaded tree frog. It likes to hang out in the little ponds that form in cavities within bromeliad plants. University of British Columbia zoologist Roz Dakin, who worked with Kane on this study.
There are species that dance and vibrate on perches, and the female is sharing the same perch as the male and feeling what's going on through parts of her body like her feet. There are species where birds rub feathers on each other. What we're suggesting here is that a sensory function of feathers in social displays may be more widespread than we appreciate right now.
The researchers also point out that there are at least 35 other types of birds distributed across 10 taxonomic orders that have both head crests and displays with the vibration component.
A lot of those kind of tactile aspects of displays are really not even very well described.
And so we were just gobsmacked to find out that, in fact, they did agree.
What all that means is that the peafowl's head crests are specifically tuned to the vibrations produced by the train rattling of its own species. The crests thus act like a sort of special antenna, meant to pick up a single kind of sound. A biologist might see those feathers and assume they are visual signals, but as a physicist, Kane had a different idea.
We were curious in my laboratory about whether the preferred vibrational properties of the crest feathers might, by any chance, agree with the preferred vibrational properties of this train rattling display that the males do.
Goldman. One of the most impressive scenes in the world of birds is a peacock displaying its impressive iridescent feathers, technically known as its train. While the female peahen looks on, the peacock spreads his train out and ruffles it back and forth as the sun highlights the red, blue, and green within the feathers.
So what is the connection between AI and rhinoceri? Surprisingly direct.
Bernard Mayerson, Chief Innovation Officer at IBM. He spoke recently at the Cooper Union here in New York City as part of a panel discussing the intersection of artificial intelligence, AI, ethics, and healthcare. So where do rhinos come in?
As you know, poaching rhinos is a huge problem. The rhinoceros horn represents about 30 years of revenue, 30 years of income to an individual in sub-Saharan Africa. And that is why, basically, if you manage to kill a rhino and get a horn, it essentially is like winning the lottery. Unfortunately, it's not so good for the rhino, not to mention you deplete a precious species yet again. And poaching is a huge issue.
Eight years ago, the jury in the trial of Casey Anthony announced their verdict.
As to the charge of first-degree murder, verdict as to count 1, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty, so say we all.
Anthony had been charged with murdering her 2-year-old daughter, but like the murder charge, the jury's decision for additional charges of aggravated child abuse and aggravated manslaughter were again
not guilty.
July 20th marks 50 years since human beings first landed on the moon. That momentous date in 1969 made astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin household names. But years before that, a lesser-known figure was on a mission to make that first moon landing possible. His name was John Hobart. The son of Dutch immigrants, Hobart grew up on a farm in Joliet, Illinois. He studied engineering at the University of Illinois and eventually worked his way to NASA. Tobacco plants, of course, are grown to make cigarettes. But tobacco is also used a lot in scientific research, and a new study shows tobacco can be genetically engineered to churn out large amounts of a commercially important bacterial enzyme known as cellulase. The enzyme has many industrial uses, including as an agent in the production of biofuel. And even while their plant machinery is being co-opted as an enzyme-making factory, the plants suffer no reduction in yield while grown out in the field compared with unaltered plants. That fact is rather remarkable because you might suspect that when a plant is expending resources to create large amounts of cellulase, it would struggle to grow. But that's not the case here.
No trip to the beach would be complete without a swarm of hungry gulls. But don't get distracted, because one of those gulls may soon go after your food.
There's a very small proportion of extremely bold individuals that seem to ruin the reputation of the whole species.
Neil Choboger, an animal behavior researcher at the University of Exeter. She studied the food snatching habits of gulls in seaside towns in the southern UK, and she found that very few, only the boldest, would actually take the bait.
The arms race that we see in computer terms and on the internet is basically that the protection mechanisms that people are putting in place, such as firewalls, antivirus software, are now increasingly having to become more complex, as well as new additional protection tools as the attackers and hackers and people trying to do malicious things on the internet are developing new attack techniques.
So far in our discussion of chemical reactions, we have assumed that these reactions only go in one direction, the forward direction, from left to right as we read it in an equation. That's why our arrow points from left to right. Reactants react together to make products. However, this is not exactly how things occur in nature. In fact, practically every chemical reaction is reversible, meaning the products can also react together to reform the reactants that they were made of. So instead of writing that single arrow facing from left to right, a more appropriate symbol would be a double arrow, one going from left to right and one going from right to left. Reactants are continuously reacting to form products, but at the same time, as those products are formed, they remake the reactants. They're both going simultaneously, forming each other. This is what we would call a state of equilibrium.
For some people, this proposition may seem far-fetched, but ending poverty is both morally necessary and actually feasible. All of us must play a role in making it happen. All human beings want and have a right to live in dignity, to determine our own destinies, and to be respected by other people. Despite the universality of these rights, our capacities to fulfill them vary enormously. And no dividing line is more profound in influencing the quality of our lives than the gulf between poverty and prosperity.
Well, there's a positive obligation on the bank to ensure that the people who are signing a loan guarantee know what they're doing. Loan guarantees are kind of unique in that someone is giving security or a guarantee and placing themselves at risk for someone else, and they receive nothing material in return. So you've got to ask yourself, why is this person doing this? Do they know what they're doing? They're risking a lot and not really getting anything back for it. So the imperative is that the bank must ensure that these people know what they're doing and that they fully understand the implications of what they're doing, and they know that their properties may be sold if another person doesn't meet their obligations.
Let's take a fish we found from the Arctic. This fish has fins, but when you open up the fins, you find bones that correspond to the upper arm, the forearm, even parts of the wrist. And what's amazing about that is we can trace that fish to amphibians, to reptiles, to primates, all the way to us. The transition from life in water to life on land is not some strange event in the history of life. It's an event that's embedded in our bodies. Every time we bend our wrists, every time we breathe with our lungs, we can thank those fish evolving in streams 375 million years ago.
A creature called the Atlantic razor clam had a secret. Digging in wet sand should be slow and take lots of effort, but the razor clam could burrow a centimeter per second and go half a kilometer using only about a AA battery's worth of energy. These talents intrigued MIT researchers who thought that a robotic version of the clam would have practical uses, so they studied how the mollusk moves. They found that the clam first contracts its shell. That action causes sand to fall inward towards the animal. Further shell contraction draws water into the mix. At that point, the watery sand starts to behave as a fluid, think quicksand. The drag on the burrowing clam is dramatically reduced, and it starts to really move. The process requires pinpoint timing of contractions and digging.
Grill masters already know that a cold brew is a fine companion at the barbecue. So here's some science to toast to. Marinating meat in beer actually cuts the number of potentially cancer-causing compounds that form, as chops sizzle on the grill. So it says a report in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry. The study started out like any barbecue, with pork chops, charcoal, and beer. Researchers marinated the chops for 4 hours in either regular or non-alcoholic Pilsner or a dark ale. Then they fired up the grill. After cooking, they analyzed the chops for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, which are found in smoked and grilled meats and may up your risk of cancer.
Once upon a time, there was an animal called a pelosa that caught insects with its trunk. Some pelosas had wide trunks, others had skinny trunks. When habitat changes caused their dinners to tunnel underground, pelosas with wide trunks began to starve and die. The pelosas with thin trunks could still reach the bugs, so they stayed healthy and had babies that also had thin trunks. Eventually, all pelosas had skinny trunks, and they lived happily ever after. Or they might have, if they were real.
Last fall, researchers quizzed 6,000 Americans, age 18 to 65, on health insurance and the new law. Half didn't know about the insurance marketplaces or their subsidies. 42% couldn't define a deductible. And 2/3 didn't know the difference between an HMO, with its restrictive physician network, and a PPO, which typically offers more flexibility. The full survey is in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Study author Sylvia Elena Barcelos of USC says those most likely to benefit from the law, like uninsured young and low-income respondents, typically know the least.
It's very hard to believe that people will make informed choices without having knowledge of these basic concepts.
And until we master the basics, she says, simpler insurance options might be just what the doctor ordered.